What's up, everyone? Welcome to my review of Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin. Now, if you don't know me, my name is Chris, and I'm a full-time content creator. You can find me streaming upwards of 30 hours a week between Tuesday and Friday on Twitch. I have a few different series of videos that I post to YouTube. Alongside reviews, I also do impressions of games I've tried but not finished, a fun series I just fired up called Out of a Hat, and a monthly video that I like to coin as the most thorough release schedule on the internet, Future Dubs. If any of that sounds neat, I'd encourage you to subscribe and go check out my other videos. Finally, you can also find me on Twitter, TikTok, Hover, and Facebook. And if you really want to help support me, you can also check out my Patreon, all of which are linked below. But enough about me, let's talk about
Chaos. 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 Chaos.
Chaos.
Announced during the Square Enix Presents livestream at E3 2021, Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin promised to be a bold new vision for Final Fantasy. The game is a collaboration between Team Ninja and Square Enix and positioned itself as a retelling of the original Final Fantasy story from 1987. Alongside the announcement trailer, a demo was released, allowing people to go hands-on with the game. A few months later, the release date was announced for March, and a second demo was released, allowing players to explore a new area with a new ally. This demo also introduced the multiplayer functionality, which I won't be covering much in this review. Finally, a week before launch, a third and final demo was launched, allowing players to start their journey and carry their progress over to the full game upon release. Side note, that ability to carry over your progress is amazing. Square Enix has really leaned into that feature with Dragon Quest XI, Octopath Traveler, and now Stranger of Paradise. I wish every publisher would copy this. Final Fantasy is a staple in video games and has been for over 35 years. They started life as 2D pixel art turn-based globe-trekking adventures, but over the years, the releases have become more and more action-focused, with the last several mainline games abandoning the turn-based mechanics entirely. It's also no secret that over the last decade or so, Souls-likes have become one of the most beloved and influential forces in games. While the Demon Souls, Dark Souls, and Bloodborns have flipped the action RPG genre on its head, another series of very good games has also risen up called Nioh. Nioh, developed by Team Ninja, is a series set in feudal Japan and takes its own approach to the Souls-like genre. Nioh relies on slightly faster-paced combat, the implementation of stances in combat, more instanced levels and areas, and a heavy dose of loot to customize your character. Keep those things in mind as we talk about Stranger in Paradise, because those influences will become pretty obvious. Now, before we dive into the specifics, I want to offer up a couple extra details. I spent just shy of 24 hours in the game, I played it on PlayStation 5, and finished all the main story missions and all of the side quests available to me. I also played the game in story mode versus action and hard mode, and I'll explain why in the review, but for now, I just want to get those details out there. Let's start with the story. You play the role of Jack, who is also accompanied by his 4 teammates, Jed, Ash, Neon, and Sophia. Together, they are called the Warriors of Light and are heroes that are destined to fight the darkness taking over the land. This game has been labeled as a retelling of the original Final Fantasy, but in my opinion, this feels more like Square Enix provided Team Ninja with a bare-bones outline of the original game and told them to go nuts. Then, Team Ninja did, in fact, go nuts. When the game started out, it felt like I had honestly loaded someone else's save. It was such a jarring introduction to a game that made me feel confused constantly and frustrated with the entire approach to storytelling. Throughout my entire adventure, I never felt like I had a good grasp on what the game was going for. I'm not going to say it didn't make sense at the end, but the ending wasn't so well done as to erase the miserable storytelling, dialogue, and world building along the way. Along with the disjointed delivery of the story scenes comes the abysmal writing for almost all of the characters. While I don't think the characters were poorly acted, their material was among some of the worst I've seen in games. This shouldn't come as much of a surprise for a game that was instantly memed after its introduction trailer, showcasing at least a dozen uses of the word chaos in what was approximately 2.5 minutes. There's maybe one character, Astos, that had any kind of effect on me, but the rest held no interest to me. Now that doesn't sound great, but it's actually a compliment when you compare them to the main character, Jack, who is an insufferable jerk. Jack makes lightning from Final Fantasy XIII look like a freaking Teletubby from a personality standpoint. There are story reasons as to why he is the way he is, but it doesn't change the fact that every interaction with him is cringeworthy because of his one-dimensional loathing of everything and everyone, and his constant drive to destroy chaos. Another head-scratching aspect of world building and contextualization of the world comes in your interaction with NPCs in the game. NPC storytelling has always been a fixture in Final Fantasy games, with random citizens giving you hints and tips as to how you could progress further. This method allows towns and areas to feel more alive and lived in. In Stranger of Paradise, your NPC interactions are hidden in a menu on the world map screen. You select a character from a list from any point in the story, and you are treated to a short cutscene between Jack and the NPC. They're not interesting. They convey nothing of value and are an absolute waste of time. One of these scenes, not kidding, was the character saying, "Ugh," and then it sent me back to the menu to choose my next interaction. Truly riveting stuff. There are plenty more examples, but to put it bluntly, this story couldn't have been conveyed worse. If it wasn't for my Final Fantasy fandom, there is literally zero chance I would have sat around to the end. While it was interesting to see a mature approach to a Final Fantasy game, complete with tons of blood and F-bombs, it all felt just absolutely wasted. If there's a silver lining to the story scenes, it's that they take up less time than the core gameplay loop. After the intro to the game, you'll eventually find yourself placed on the world map for the first time. The best way I can explain the world map and mission select aspects of the game is to reference Final Fantasy X-2, XIII-2, and Neo. With nothing connecting one area to the next, you're forced to choose your next mission from a world map view. Each locale offers a main mission quest or a side quest, and once selected, you get a short narrative either summarizing events you just witnessed or explaining your mission objectives. Once you confirm your selection, you're transported to the dungeon to work your way through. These areas will have multiple paths with enemies wandering around, items strewn about, and interactive elements. Typically, the loop has you exploring these areas, finding items, fighting enemies, and working toward your goal, which typically is a boss of some sort. Aside from a few areas, the dungeon design is pretty uninspired, and with no waypoint or map system, sometimes finding the proper path can be a bit confusing. While I don't think every game needs a map and waypoint system, having a repetitive-looking dungeon and adding to that a combat system that has the camera constantly swiveling makes it really easy to lose track of where you've been and where you're going. While treasure chests litter the dungeon, chests aren't the only way to gather up new materials. Enemies are constantly dropping loot as well. This brings us to one of the more interesting and intriguing aspects of the game for me: character customization. If you're someone who likes loot in games, Stranger of Paradise will absolutely scratch that itch. You have 500 inventory spots to fill up, and I think I had those all used up by the end of the third or fourth mission. Having as much loot as you have in this game, though, does make it hard to form a connection to any of the equipment that you have at any given time. There's an upgrade and dismantle system in the game, and while I use the dismantle function constantly just to keep inventory spaces open, I never even touched the upgrade system. That system allows you to use parts of your dismantled weapons to make incremental changes to the weapons you'd like to use, but because I was finding better gear every 10 minutes or so, I never felt inclined to use it. If I'm going to give one main gripe about the equipment system, is that a lot of equipment you find is repeat equipment. There's a lot of customization options within the equipment, but I wish they would have backed off on the sheer amount of items you find on each run. Cutting the amount of items by 50 or even 75% would really encourage more people to use the upgrade system more as well. The last thing I want to talk about regarding the gameplay loop is the job system. Anyone familiar with Final Fantasy knows that jobs play a role in most of the entries, sometimes more than others. It's no different here. There are more than 20 jobs available in this game, and you can really customize your play experience beyond loot. Certain jobs can only equip certain weapons, so keeping one or two of each weapon type is a good idea should you want to change things up. Also, there is equipment in the game that you can put on to get affinity bonuses. These bonuses allow you to earn XP for jobs that you don't currently have equipped. That system is nice as it allows you to commit to a job you'd like, but not completely neglect the other jobs should you feel inclined to change later. Also, each job has a maximum level of 30, which is actually pretty easily attainable. I only had 10 or so jobs not mastered by the end of my playthrough. All of this factors into how the combat plays out. Before we talk about combat though, I want to make sure I state again that I played this game on story mode. I did that because the core combat follows a combo system that I'm not a fan of in general. Thankfully, when I play through these games though, I play them with my community on Twitch, and I had a lot of people tell me that they'd really like this system based on what they'd seen. While the combat didn't necessarily vibe with me, I heard from a lot of people that thought it looked really good. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's talk about how combat works. I mentioned earlier that Nioh relies on slightly faster paced combat, the implementation of stances in combat, more instanced levels and areas, and a heavy dose of loot to customize your characters. I mention those specifically because those exact elements are what you'll see in Stranger of Paradise. The combat is fast-paced. Instead of stances, you have your various jobs. And you have a constant flow of new weapons and armor to equip. Each class has its own skill tree that unlocks new combo moves, passive improvements, additional abilities, and eventually even new jobs. There were some abilities that I didn't really understand the benefit of having, which may have been due to my aversion to some of the core combat mechanics in the first place, but for the most part, the feeling of character progression from a combat perspective felt constant and rewarding. I should also mention, as it came up often in my chat, you only play as Jack in this game. You have the ability to play as the others if you play multiplayer, but you'll never directly control anyone else in the main story. I touched briefly on the idea of side quests earlier, so let's quickly discuss those. Side quests fall into two camps: track down a stranger who suffered a tragedy and has transformed into a monster, or refight a boss. That's it. The areas you visit for your side quests are the same as the areas you visited in the main mission, but the objective might be at the beginning of the level and you're starting from the end, or parts of the level are blocked off so the area you're exploring is smaller. Either way, these side quests are lifeless, soulless filler materials thrown in to pad out the length of the game. They add nothing, but they really shouldn't be skipped from a progression standpoint. Here's why. Each mission you take on has a gear level tied to it, so it's hard to say don't do these quests, because if you don't, you'll have a real hard time keeping your gear level in line for future missions. I did everything as it opened up to me, and by the end of the game I was still underleveled. Again, I was playing on story mode, a mode more difficult than that, and I likely would have hit a pretty good roadblock. Now we've covered the story and the gameplay, let's talk a bit about the way the game is presented. I played the PS5 version of this game and I was pretty underwhelmed with the visuals. One thing specifically that started to get to me was the hazy, washed out look to everything. Some areas were better than others, but some locations were not much fun to look at all. As a PS5 game, there's really nothing here that screams next/current gen. I even had some noticeable frame rate drops in areas, mostly when engaging in combat with multiple enemies. And the final thing regarding presentation that I'd like to talk about is the music. Some of my favorite video game music comes from the Final Fantasy series, and while the music included in Stranger of Paradise didn't really move the needle much for me, there are a few renditions of famous songs from other Final Fantasies sprinkled in throughout the game, one of which was included in the second demo as you journey through the Refren wetlands. Final Fantasy XIII fans should immediately recognize the Sunleth waterscape that starts playing. This wasn't the only musical nod to other games in the series, and while it certainly doesn't make a lot of sense to have these songs show up in the game, I'll never balk at the opportunity to listen to new versions of amazing music from throughout this series' illustrious history. As is typical with my videos, I'm going to quickly summarize my review into a list of positives and negatives and wrap my thoughts up. Let's start with the positives. Character customization. There is so much loot in this game, admittedly perhaps too much, but the cosmetic changes are always fun to play around with. While I think much of the duplicate items could be eliminated, there's nothing better than going into battle with a 5-headed dragon while wearing a dorky fedora. Eventually I just relied on optimizing my equipment, but for the Fashion Souls folks, you'll be right at home here. Job system. It took me a couple of days of reflecting to decide that I actually was really impressed with the job system. Now that's a lot coming from me because historically the Final Fantasies that have utilized the job system are my least favorite. Each job felt pretty unique, especially the further you pressed into each upgrade tree. And the ability to make smaller advancements to jobs that you don't have equipped using the affinity system was very welcome. One of my biggest issues with other job systems is that fear of missing out. This affinity system is a really good way to counteract that. Now on to the negatives. Story. I am in no way being hyperbolic when I say that this storytelling is some of the worst I've experienced in gaming. It is difficult to follow at best and complete gibberish at worst. Even being uniquely presented with a game that I already know the overarching story of, I was still left shaking my head at points. This might teeter on the precipice of it's so bad it's good for some people, but for me, it's just bad. Main character. Jack is absolutely the worst. For story purposes, I get that he's supposed to be a moody prick, but having him as the main character is simply exhausting, and it devalues every other relationship that develops in the game. My genuine loathing for Jack made every other character matter less because of their connection to him. This isn't a voiceover problem. This is a we wrote a genuinely awful character problem. Side quests. Not a single side quest was unique in this game. Each one told the same story. Stranger's backstory, didn't work out, got killed, swallowed by chaos, now we have to go kill a monster. The ones that weren't that were just your team going back and fighting a slightly powered up boss that you'd already fought in the main story. This game has some of the most uninspired side quest implementation I've seen in video games. Level/dungeon design. Mildly interesting describes the best of the dungeons you'll come across throughout the game. That's from a visual perspective. At worst, the twisting paths and samey environments without the use of a waypoint or map system will have you running in circles trying to decipher where you came from and where you're going. NPCs. I simply cannot understand why NPC conversations were implemented in this way. Choose a name from a menu, wait for a loading screen. Yeah, that happens. Listen to a line or two of dialogue that, for the most part, has no pertinence on the game itself, return to menu, choose next character to talk to. I didn't even know this menu existed until halfway through the game. I could have gone on not knowing, and it would have made for a better overall experience. Visuals. Underwhelming. A weird haze hung over everything, and some areas were so washed out that it almost looked like masking the visuals was an actual goal. We're not talking N64 or PlayStation levels of fog, but still not as crisp and clear as I'd like to see on my $500 current-gen console. If you love loot in your games and customizing your characters, then you'll probably find something here. If the combo-based Neo-esque combat intrigues you, then yeah, sure, check it out. If you're a hardcore Final Fantasy I fan, something could trigger that nostalgia factor a bit. To everyone else, I can't possibly recommend this game. It feels incomplete, incoherent, and messy. While I don't think that a game ever needs 3 demos, especially in a 9-month announcement to release window, the final demo allowing you to carry your save data over will always be one of my favorite things that Square Enix has implemented for their RPGs, and should absolutely be utilized for anyone on the fence with this game. My final score for Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin is a disappointing 5. Thank you guys for checking out my review of Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin. While my overall experience left me disappointed, let me know if you agree with my take or if you think I'm being too hard on it. Ask in the comments, join the Discord, or come hang out in my Twitch chat at twitch.tv/CW719. I'll be streaming there Tuesday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Central Time. You can also find me on the socials linked below, and if you really enjoyed the video, maybe you consider becoming a patron as well. Thanks again, everyone, and we'll talk to you soon.